"Allender, are you ready?" the husband called. They went to the mountains for 2 weeks to hunt elk. She was looking for her foam mat. She knew that sleeping on the ground would be very uncomfortable without some kind of foam between her body and the ground might be damp and cold. "Brian, have you seen my rug?" "I already put it in the truck," he responded. She grabbed her backpack from the floor by the door, and they walked towards the truck. The trip promised to be long. Brian Solin watched as his wife walked outside and down the sidewalk. He still couldn't believe that he had convinced her to marry him. They had been married for 3 months, and his heart was racing every time he looked at her. She was a tall, slender, dark-haired girl. Her hair was black with a bluish tint. She was wearing tight blue jeans and a buttoned-up white blouse. She looked so sexy that he wanted to call her back and have sex right now. She clearly wasn't wearing a bra. She was bright and athletic. She climbed inside and looked at him. "What?" she asked. "I just can't believe how beautiful you are." She smiled, white teeth flashing against her creamy face. She had rare, pale, almost translucent skin, and was cautious as she spent a lot of time outdoors, running around their neighborhood every morning and spending many days by the backyard pool. They both loved hiking and hunting. This was the second time they had been together, and he knew she was a good shot with any weapon. Her father raised deer and elk in the Upper Peninsula, and they looked forward to hunting. She hoped to take at least one of them. Brian wasn't much of a bow hunter, but he admired it. She looked at her boyish husband and felt something warm inside. She knew how lucky she was. He was an amazing lover, and Allender couldn't get enough of him. They were going to wait a little longer to have children. They simply enjoyed being married. Brian was a dream come true for her. They met during their senior year of college, and she knew she had found the other half of her soul. There was just something about him that made her melt. He was smart, witty, and had a sense of humor that matched hers. He was an outdoors man just like her, and he was the hottest man she had ever met. Those big brown eyes, a swimmer's body, and a stunning lover. Allender was in love, lusted after, and married the man she wanted to spend the rest of her life with. It was a long way from Colorado, so they stopped for the night in Des Moines. Towards the evening of the next day, they entered a leadoux and met their guides there. They were introduced, and they immediately liked one of them. Peter Thompson was a little cowboy about 5 feet 8 inches tall and weighing 120 pounds. He looked to be in his late 40s, wiry and light on his feet. The second guide was Rains Parker. He was completely different. He was about 6 feet 5 inches tall, weighed 250 pounds, and looked like a refugee from the 60s. He had long black hair and a ponytail and was very quiet. Allender thought he looked like he was in his early 20s and was very handsome. His arms were heavy with muscle, and it looked like he had no neck. When he shook her hand, she felt very small. Since she was almost 6 feet tall herself, she was a little alarmed. "Don't pay any attention to Rains," Peter chuckled. "In the 3 months that I've known him, he hasn't said even 500 words. He is a college student. He played football for the Raiders for a time, but he knows the forest. His father was a forester in these parts, and he knows the area like the back of his hand." They had dinner, and Brian and Allender tried bison for the first time. Rains prepared the food, and she came over to ask if she needed help. "No, I can handle it myself," he said. His voice was the deepest bass Allender had ever heard. If a grizzly bear could talk, she thought that's what it would sound like. "You can set the table if you want," he said. "The dishes are in that closet over there. Silverware in the bottom drawer." She set the table, and Peter poured her some good red wine. The bison was delicious, and Rains was a good cook. They talked about where they would go, and when she mentioned that she wanted to use a bow, Rains's eyes lit up. "Do you hunt with a bow?" she asked him. He nodded. "What kind of bow do you have?" he asked. "I shoot a 65-pound bear bow with Quest Power Punch arrows with 125-grain Hellraiser dots," she said. "I'm learning to use a long bow, but I'm not confident enough to try it yet. I'm making my own bow, but it's not ready yet." He looked at her for a while. "I'm surprised and impressed. Most women cannot cope with such a burden." "Well, this is something new," Peter laughed. "Rains is not easy to impress. Do you bow hunt too, Brian?" No, it's too much work for me, Brian laughed. Well, let's send these two, and we'll kill someone too, Peter said to Brian. Last season, my clients and I killed 5 moose Allender, Rains said. Her big blue eyes sparkled with excitement. I want something tasty, she said. It doesn't have to be huge, but I want good things. Brian also just wants moose. He'll get it, Rains told her. If he can get Peter to shut up and come closer. Peter is really very good. They went to bed early and got up at 6 in the morning. It was very cold, and Allender shivered until she put on her gear. They put on many layers of clothes, and by the time Allender got dressed, Rains had already prepared breakfast. They ate quickly, hurrying to leave, and when they finished, Rains tied the horses outside. Allender tied the bow to the saddle, and they climbed into the saddle. She was a little stiff from yesterday's ride, and her joints felt like they were creaking. She soon straightened up and, as they left the path, kissed Brian. Brian and Peter continued on their way, and Rains led her along a winding path that skirted the mountain and climbed steeply up the slope. They drove for about an hour, and suddenly a view of the Great Canyon opened up in front of her. Rains took his glasses out of his saddlebag, and she followed him. At 3 o'clock, he told her, about 2 miles from here, on the other side of these aspen trees. She looked and saw 6 moose moving across the clearing. What do you think? She asked. From here, the second bull looks quite large. He's quite nice, he told her. He's not a record holder, but he's very nice. Are you interested? Are you hoping to find something better? She asked him. Yes, but you have to look for it. Let's try it and see what we can come up with. Best the enemy of the good. She agreed, and they drove into the canyon. By the time Rains arrived and dismounted, it was hot, and Allender was getting hot. They tied the horses, and she took off 2 layers. She felt like she was being watched and looked at Rains. He looked at her with obvious approval. What the heck? She felt a little awkward. Her face flushed slightly, and she turned to him. What? Nothing. You are a very beautiful woman. I'm sorry if I caused you any inconvenience. She shrugged. Brian always tells me this. For some reason, she felt like she should mention her husband. Forget. Let's go hunting. She lowered her bow and took out her arrows. They came closer to the place where the elk had just been and looked in there. Allender's heart sank. They were 1/2 mile away and moving on. Well, let's try to get ahead of them? She asked. No, I don't think so, Rains said thoughtfully. We would have to climb over this wall and we wouldn't be able to take the horses. By the time we get up, there is no telling where they will be. Let's go into the next canyon to the south and see what we find there. They made 2 more passes that day. One of them was empty, and Allender didn't want the bull to get close enough. His horn was broken, and Rains agreed that she should give it up. It was already late, and they decided to return. They rode in companionable silence most of the way. Before they reached the hut, Rains stopped. I have an idea, he said. It means getting up around 3 and driving for 3 hours, but there's a big bull there that I'd love to take you on. What do you think? I'm in the game. Look, Rains, I'm not disappointed about today. I just love being here. I want moose, but that's just a bonus. Being in this place hunting, that's what's important to me. Brian and Peter were already back when they arrived. They had seen the elk, but were in a canyon that they could not reach from their position, and were planning to try to capture it tomorrow. They had dinner, and the next morning, Allender and Rains set off early. It was very cold when they got up, and they quickly had breakfast and saddled their horses before the others got up. The ride through the dark forest had left Allender a little unsettled, and she was glad that Rains was with her and knew where they were going. As the sun rose, they approached the place where they wanted to hunt, and at 10:30, Allender noticed a group of elk in the aspen thickets. They followed and found themselves within 200 yards of the largest moose Allender had ever seen. It started to rain, and the moose were restless. We have to do this now, Rains whispered. They are going to move to a more reliable shelter. When we rise, you take it. You have a chance. This is a very good bull, Allender. She moved closer, waiting for the bull to lower his head so he could lunge. He turned a little more to the side, and Allender, bending down, released an arrow. It was a perfect shot, just behind the front leg and just below center. The huge animal shuddered and rushed forward, as if fired from a cannon. Allender was shaking with adrenaline and rushed at Rains. "Did you see that?" "I got him, Rains. You couldn't have taken a better shot." Her arms wrapped around his neck, and she pulled him in for a hug and a kiss on the cheek. "It's huge. How long do we have to wait before we go looking for him?" She calmed down a little and realized that her body was wrapped around him, and she blushed even more. She pulled herself free and moved away a little. "Let's take the horses and then go after him," Rains suggested. It was raining heavily and the temperature seemed to be plummeting. The sky was completely overcast and cold steam rose from the ground. They led their horses to the place where she had shot the arrow and began to search for the trail. They made easy progress through the aspen thickets, and when, after a quarter of a mile, they reached the edge of the meadow, they quickly discovered the elk almost exactly in the center of the clearing. Allender asked Rains to take some photos, and she also took a photo of him standing by the elk. They immediately went to work bandaging the animal, and Rains helped her quarter him. They wrapped him in the plastic he had brought with him and placed him in canvas bags for transport. By the time they tied him to the horses, it was snowing heavily, and visibility was close to zero. The wind began to howl, and, strangely enough for Allender, lightning crackled all around. She was very scared, and Rains was walking pretty fast. Half a mile later, he stopped in front of her and got off his horse. He put his hand to her ear and screamed to be heard over the howling wind. "There's a stone wall about 20 feet ahead. Keep an eye out for an overhang, a rubble, a cave, or anything we can use for cover. We need to find a place to sit." She nodded. They moved forward, and a wall came into view. They walked along it for about half a mile, and it gradually ended. "We have to go back the other way and look for it," Rains shouted in her ear. Now the ground was covered with snow, and it was getting thicker. They returned, and, after walking 100 yards, they could no longer see their tracks. Allender was dressed in good gear, but water had leaked in some places, and she was shivering as the warmth drained from her body. A dark opening in the wall appeared ahead. Rains dismounted and examined it. It was large at the entrance and went out about 15 feet before shrinking into a narrow throat. They led the horses into the first room and looked into the narrow passage. Beyond the neck, they saw another small room, about 6 feet by 6 feet. Allender was shaking uncontrollably, and Rains knew she was in trouble. "I'll go look for wood to make a fire," he said. "Take everything off the horses if you can. We can use the blankets and pads they have under their saddles. Find my lighters in my backpack, and I'll start a fire as soon as I can. Work will help you stay warm." Allender was so cold that she could barely concentrate, but she began to unsaddle the horses when Rains took the axe and disappeared into the snow. She cursed her stupid, stiff fingers as she fiddled with the girths. She managed to remove the saddles, and she placed the pads on the floor of the small room, on top of which lay the blankets. She put down her foam pillow and placed pillows and blankets on it. After clumsily rummaging through Rain's backpack, she managed to open it and find a dry bag with 3 lighters and a can of liquid inside. She made a circle of large stones just inside the narrow part of the shallow cave. The smoke should come out when they build a fire there, and it will also give the horses some warmth. By the time she finished, Rains had returned with an armful of dry wood that he had broken off from standing trees. He quickly broke off small branches and used them to build a small wigwam in the center of the stone circle. He gradually broke larger pieces until there were pieces the size of his wrist on top. Allender helped, and soon they had a decent pile. Rains sprayed lighter fluid on the smallest branches and wet them well. He made a small trace of the liquid and lit it with a lighter. The flame ran up the trail, and the pile burst into flames. 10 minutes later, they made a good fire, and Allender stretched out her frozen hands to the fire. She trembled and chirped her teeth. Rains was very worried when he looked at her and saw that her lips were bluish in color. "Allender, are you wet?" "Yes, some of my clothes are wet and I'm freezing." she said, through chattering teeth. "We need to dry your clothes," he told her. "You'll never stay warm as long as you're in wet clothes. Take off everything wet and wrap yourself in blankets. We'll hang your clothes on sticks by the fire to dry." The last thing she wanted was to undress in the cold air, but she was frozen. "Don't look," she told him. "I swear," he promised. "Do you want to be modest or lively?" She walked away and stripped down to her bra and panties. Her bra was also wet and she took it off, quickly wrapping herself in the blanket. She hurried back to the fire as Rains gathered her clothes. He stuck sticks into the stones and hung her clothes on the sticks closer to the fire. She was still shaking uncontrollably, and Rains became very worried. She was unlikely to recover beyond a certain point of hypothermia and needed to be warmed up quickly. She was very sleepy and lethargic and did not notice how he took off his clothes. She perked up a little when he picked her up and laid her on the saddle cushions, which he brought closer to the fire. She felt a rush of cold air as he opened the blankets and then felt his warm skin against her cold body. He shuddered when he felt her nearby. She felt him lay her back on the saddle cushions, and his heavy body lay upon her, deliciously warm and spreading comfort through her. Allender floated in a sleepy haze, shuddering every now and then as the core of her body, trying to conserve heat, sent tremors through her. She felt her nipples, very erect from the cold, scraping against his chest as they breathed, and this sensation seemed somehow wrong to her, but in her daze she could not pinpoint this thought, and she did not have the strength to continue her. The fire grew as it began to consume large sticks, and embers began to form. The air in the small room warmed, and Allender began to warm up little by little, the combination of her body heat and the heat from the fire keeping her warm. She became more aware of her surroundings and the fact that she was under the covers, almost naked with a nearly naked man who was not her husband. "Rains?" She looked into his eyes. "I'm very sorry, Allender," he apologized. "For me, you are a very attractive woman. We are practically naked here, and we will sit like this for a while. I'm not a very sociable guy. I don't think I've ever met a woman like you. You are everything I could ever imagine wanting in a woman. If you were fat and ugly, the fact that you are so independent, smart, funny, and interested in everything I have would make me want you. You're not fat or ugly. You are stunningly beautiful. You have a body to die for, and I can feel those big breasts pressing against me. You feel like silk, and it's very exciting. I think this is the most I've talked to anyone in a year." "Thank you, Rains, that's very flattering. But I'm married," she said. "I understand that perfectly," he said. "I'm trying to act like a gentleman." "I appreciate it," she said. "Let's forget about it. Let's just stay here and try to stay warm. Do you mind if I sleep? Maybe it will be better this way." "How long do you think we will stay here?" "I have no idea," Rains replied. "This could happen in a few hours, or maybe in a few days. We won't starve, but we will be thirsty if we don't melt the snow. I have several pans that we can use. I really don't want to leave you here, but I need more wood. I'll use the walkie-talkie and let Peter and your husband know that we're safe and hiding in the cave." "I'll be fine," she said. "Now I feel warmer. As soon as my clothes are dry, I will help you. I don't need help right now. You were just scared. Just stay here and I'll come back." Within an hour, he had stacked a huge supply of firewood, including several large logs inside the cave, and turned around some of the elk they had taken. He cut strips from the waste and put them on green sticks, placing them on the edge of the fire. As the juices began to drip and sizzle, a delicious aroma began to permeate the air. He went out and brushed the snow, now over a foot deep, aside and tore off huge tufts of grass, bringing them inside for the horses to eat. He hobbled them, not that they could go far in such a storm, and the elk stripes were already reedy. Allender turned them over the fire, her stomach growling. Her clothes were not yet dry, so she was wrapped in blankets. Rains took salt out of his backpack and they ate. It was the most delicious thing Allender had ever tasted. It tasted like very tender beef, and they ate everything they had prepared. Rains took 2 metal pans and filled them with snow. They melted the snow over the fire and connected them. He went back and got more, and they repeated the process until they had about half a gallon of clean water. He placed it in the outer cave to cool and covered the fire with large logs to last the night. It was already completely dark, and they decided to get some sleep. Allender stood up, and they made a kind of mattress out of the saddle pads. It was narrow, less than 3 feet wide, and they barely fit. She lay down, and Rains stripped down to his boxers and socks. She didn't want to look, but her eyes were inevitably drawn to him. He was incredibly muscular. His professional football background was obvious. He had several large scars on his knees where he had apparently had surgery. He didn't have the big belly she usually associated with football players. She guessed he must have lost a lot of weight from his football days. He slid under the covers next to her. She immediately felt warmer and at the same time very uncomfortable. The only way for both of them to stay on the pads is to either lie on their sides with their bodies touching or at least half on top of each other. Allender turned her back to Rains, and he did the same. His back seemed very wide and warm to her, and the awkwardness of the situation kept her from falling asleep for a long time. Rains seemed to have no such difficulty, and his breathing was slow and heavy. The rhythm lulled her, and she dozed off. When she woke up, it was pitch black, and she thought she had slept for a couple of hours. They tossed and turned in their sleep until Rains was on his back, and she was laying on top of him. Her cheek rested on his chest, and her breasts were pressed against his side. When she woke up, she was unconsciously rubbing herself against his thigh and was terrified. She felt his hand slide along her back and realized with horror that he was awake and knew what she was doing. She didn't know if he knew she was awake and thought she would just carefully turn her back to him. She began to move, and suddenly his hand slid down and cupped her buttocks, pressing her against his thigh. The touch caused an involuntary movement, and her plan to quietly roll over was thwarted. This was the most awkward situation Allender had ever found herself in, and she silently cursed her traitorous body for putting her here. He flexed his hip, and it made her move again, and a moan almost escaped her lips. Her hips continued to squirm slowly, something she couldn't control. She found it very difficult to think. The feeling that left her empty was still strong in her mind. She felt his hot breath ruffle the little hairs on the back of her head as he nibbled on her earlobe. Goosebumps ran down her arms. "Oh, God," she breathed. "Rains, you're killing me." These were the first words they spoke. "You're so hot, Allender," he whispered. "God, you're so hot and you're so beautiful. I cannot do anything." As their movement slowed and stopped, his heavy weight on her felt so warm and soothing that she floated in a sea of sexual euphoria. Rains pulled away from her and hugged her, holding her close as they regained their strength. Her mind began to clear, and when the enormity of what had happened fully dawned on her, she began to cry. She trembled and sobbed as he held her. "What happened, Allender?" he asked softly. "Damn you, Rains," she sobbed. "I shouldn't have allowed this to happen. I love my husband and have never even thought about another man. Now I'm a cheater, and it will never be the same for me. I despise myself, and I hate you for it. How am I going to meet Brian? Get your hands off me, Rains. I'll go check if my clothes are dry." She stood, and he watched with regret as her incredible naked figure disappeared into the now dry clothes. She returned to the blankets and crawled into them. "You will meet him face to face as always," he said. "Nobody will ever know that this happened. I'll never tell. We are two people trapped in a situation that neither of us intentionally created. We didn't cause the storm. We didn't plan to freeze. How in the name of all that is holy can you expect anything else? We were two adults, naked in a pile of blankets in the middle of a snowstorm. It happened, and I refused to feel bad about it. In fact, I liked it, and so did you. You came 100 times. I am not your husband's rival in love. I know you love him, and nothing we did will change that. The truth is, I'm sorry. I wish I had met you first, but this did not happen. We've been stuck here for God knows how long, and I'm with the sweetest, most gorgeous, most interesting woman I've ever met. She was naked in my arms, and I swear to God, I don't regret a thing. Aren't you warm now?" Allender laughed. Well, yes, that's a plus. Rains, I truly love Brian and I wouldn't leave him for anyone else, not even you. Are you seriously trying to take this away from me? If you give me even the slightest trouble, I will come back here, hunt you down, and kill you. You'll never see me coming. Quite seriously, Allender, he said, I'm not trying to steal you for myself. I know that you are not mine and will never be mine, but I was lucky. I borrowed you for a while. I can live with it if you can. Now, I don't really like myself either, but this is not a normal situation. I know how it happened. I know that you are not a cheater. It's just not in you. If that were the case, I wouldn't be attracted to you. We are under a lot of stress, in an emergency situation, and this just happened. I pray to God that you will be mine. You don't, and I will regret it for the rest of my life. I'll just have to live with it. You will leave, we will never see each other again, and life will go on. The next chapter in your life will be without my participation. Allender looked outside. The snow stopped falling and she saw stars in the sky. After we leave here, if I ever hear your name or see you again, I swear I will hunt you down and put an arrow in your heart. Be sure. I'm leaving. Are you coming? Allender was silent the entire way home. She didn't know what to do. Her first reaction was to silently live with herself and her guilt, be the best wife a man had ever had, and spend the rest of her life making Brian deliriously happy. These thoughts haunted her for 100 miles. She will never be able to live at peace with herself. She could never be that deceitful or insincere. Brian deserves better. Damn, she realized. He deserved better than her. She will pay the piper when they return home. She curled up miserably and fell asleep. The journey was endless. She could tell that Brian sensed that she was upset, but he had no idea what it all meant. She knew that he could not imagine what happened in that cave during the storm. It was unthinkable. She herself could hardly believe it. Allender has never been promiscuous. She had been with 3 men before Brian, all of them in long-term relationships, and now her weakness and stupidity were eating her alive. Why did she let this happen? This question haunted her every minute. They unpacked their things, and he sat in the living room, checking his email. She poured 2 glasses of good whiskey and sat down next to him. "Brian, I have to tell you something," she said, calmly. He closed the computer and leaned back against the pillows. "Okay, shoot," he said. "I know something is bothering you." "I did something terrible there," she said. The story spilled out, and she felt shame and burning guilt envelop her like a shroud. She saw that he was in great pain and spared him details that could have caused him even more pain. Tears streamed down his cheeks, and she wanted to brush them away and take the pain upon herself. She barely controlled herself and held herself in an iron grip, trying to retell this sordid story in a calm and dispassionate voice, as if it were a story written by someone else about a long time ago. "We have 2 paths before us," she said. "If you want to divorce me, I will go and pack my things. I know this is what I deserve. I won't complain or whine. I'm not going to insult you by begging, although that's what I'd like to do. I will sign whatever you decide. I won't dispute anything. I'll leave and never bother you again if that's what you want." "Okay," he said. Allender's heart sank like a stone in her chest. Without another word, she stood up and began to pull out her suitcases. "What are you doing?" "I'm packing my things. Didn't I understand you correctly?" "No, I just agreed with you," he said. "You still haven't indicated the second path." She returned and took a sip of whiskey, feeling the warmth burn her. "He's not going anywhere," she said. "The second way is not to go anywhere. You will forgive me, I will repent, and we will remain married. You grant me forgiveness. I know I don't deserve this, but this is what I want. I know this will be hard and I don't deserve your forgiveness. I have no right to expect this. Are you in love with Rains?" "God, no," she said. "I barely know this man. I plan to never see him or hear his name again. This will happen no matter what you decide. I love you, Brian. You are the only man I can ever love. It's true no matter what you decide. If I divorce you, what will you do?" "I think I'll move to Canada," she said. "I always wanted to live there. This is an athlete's paradise. I'll buy myself a little hut somewhere in the middle of nowhere. Maybe Dad will come and help me get started." Brian lay motionless, and only the rocking of the drink in the glass indicated that he was alive. He didn't say anything for a long time. "No, I'm not going to divorce you, Allender. I don't want to say or do anything that I'll regret later, but I want you to leave. I don't think I can be around you for a while. Maybe I'll survive this. Maybe I won't. Yes, I believe that you don't love him and don't want to see or hear about him. But can you forget him? I'm afraid this question will torment me all my life. If I manage to survive, if what you say is true and you won't be with another man, waiting for me to get over all this." "Oh, I'm pretty sure it's true," she said. "Obviously, I can't make any promises that you can believe in, but I think you'll see the evidence." "What happened?" "I didn't plan anything like this, Brian. And you know it." "Yes, I know, Allender. It doesn't matter to me now. I'm grateful that you're alive. I hate what you did. I hate you right now. Please go away. Let me know where you're staying." Allender packed her clothes into suitcases. Her brain was paralyzed as she was mechanically packed. She needed a box for her personal belongings and walked through the living room into the garage. Brian didn't move, and she could see the tears shining on his face. Her heart was breaking. She could almost hear the sound. She managed to pull herself together until she ended up in the garage. She collapsed onto the workbench, the shreds of self-control gone, and she sobbed. Her hand was resting on something, and she looked down at the tool belt she had given him for his birthday. Her fingers felt the belt, and she was lost in a storm of grief and longing. She didn't know how long she sat there sobbing, but the grief began to recede, and a terrible rage began to overwhelm her. Rage at herself, at Rains, at the storm, at everything that had come together to end all her dreams, all her ideas of own dignity and worth as a person. She was a dirty little girl, and now she knew that about herself. There was no coming back from this. Her self-loathing grew until she felt the depths of despair. What she did to the man she loved, sitting there with tears in his eyes, was unforgivable. He loved her and she failed. It was the worst possible failure and she was broken. She took a deep, shuddering breath. Her weapon rack hung on the wall. She absorbed the beauty of these instruments of destruction. It seemed fitting that she should end her pain with something she enjoyed so much. She stood up and removed her vintage Browning Sweet 16 from its padded hooks. She opened the chamber and rummaged through the drawer for buckshot. Having found it, she inserted it into the chamber. "Allender?" Brian's voice made her shudder. "What are you doing? No! You shouldn't do that. You can't run away and leave me in this. You can't take the cheap way out. What are you trying to do? Ruin my life forever? Don't be a coward. You have never been a coward. Face the mess you've made and fix it. What the hell is wrong with you? What happened to the girl I married?" She turned to face him. "She's lost, Brian," she sobbed. "She's broken and doesn't know how to move on." "I'm so afraid." "What should I do now?" "I don't know," he said. "Not this. Promise me that when you leave, you won't do this. Find yourself, Allender. When you do, let me know. Put the gun down." Allender took a deep, shuddering breath. "I promise, Brian." She didn't put the gun down. "No, I take it with me to remember. I need all my stuff, Brian. These things are part of who I used to be." "I'll pack them tomorrow and send them to wherever you are," he said. He turned slowly and walked back into the house. Allender put the Browning in its case and carried it to her car. She took the box she came for, carried it upstairs, packed her personal belongings, and put them in the car. She walked into her office one last time, grabbed her laptop and a photo of Brian. She locked the front door behind her and headed west. She had no idea where she was going, but she knew it would be far. A couple of hours later, she called Brian and asked him to pack her things into boxes and leave them in the garage until she decided where she was going. 3 days later, she was in Winthrop, Washington. She saw a sign with the name of the town of Conconuli and felt a connection. It was a quaint little town accessible only by snowmobile in the winter, and Allender fell in love with it. There was a shop for rent with an apartment above it, and she settled into it. She sent Brian her address, and her things arrived 2 weeks later. Allender was well off financially and spent a month just getting to know the area and the local people. She discovered that she could rent large tracts of land for hunting and fishing. She opened a guide service, and by the time summer arrived, she had her first clients. They fished for trout, and she really enjoyed the job. She felt good physically, but inside, she felt dead. Her heart was damaged, and she spent time alone whenever possible. She cried at night, every night, and began to think that she would never be happy again. She was amazed that one 6-hour period of life could cause such destruction. She wrote to Brian once a week, and he always replied. As Brian watched Allender leave the house, he could barely stop himself from running after her and begging her to stay. She looked so small and broken and alone that it broke his heart. He managed to restrain himself. This was the only way forward. Allender needed to rediscover her inner strength, and she had to do it herself. They would sort out the issues between them when she was safe and sound. He was desperately afraid that, in her despair, she would forget about her promise and commit suicide, but he knew that she honestly kept her promises and hoped so. It had always been this way, except for one occasion, and it was this broken promise that left her an empty shell of herself. He hoped time would heal her. When she called him and asked for her things to be delivered to her, he knew she was on the mend. Having got rid of this burden of worries, he soon turned to other thoughts. He knew how it happened. Extraordinary circumstances took her beyond normal reactions. He knew that men were constantly pestering her. It had always been this way, and he had watched more than once how she dealt with it. He even saw her become furious when several guys refused to take no for an answer. Allender could turn into a tiger when she was touched, and he saw her break the arm of a man who groped her in the club lobby near the toilet. Has she really changed so much that she just now allowed something similar to what happened? Was all that was required for her character to collapse was the appropriate set of circumstances? If this is so, then they have no future with her. How would he know? The main question running through his head was, what was he going to do with Rains? What will Allender do if she meets this man again? His first reaction was that Rains needed to be punished. He wasn't sure how he would manage it, but this man was unscrupulous, unprofessional, and he, in Brian's opinion, basically took advantage of Allender's vulnerable state and raped her. Yes, she was an active participant, but in her weakened state, she probably couldn't function as well as she normally did. He cursed himself for failing to protect her. If he had been just a little careful and gone with her, none of this would have happened. He didn't take any blame for the act, but he was less than vigilant. He had no doubt in his ability to get Rains to pay back. The man was big and tough, but he lacked discipline, and Brian was big and tough himself. He was a high school and collegiate wrestler and knew his physical limitations. He also knew he could go to jail if he attacked Rains. It had to be something radical that would not allow for a counterstrike. Father Allender was due to visit soon. How will he explain this to Thomas? Isn't your daughter here because I kicked her out? She's a cheater and I can't live with her? She froze to death and a man took advantage of her and had sex with her, so I sent her away? He didn't want to tell Thomas any of this. Thomas was a man of the old school. He was a retired aerospace engineer and the person Brian respected more than anyone in the world. Brian was desperate for his approval, and he didn't want to explain the situation. But he decided that honesty was the best policy, and tried to come up with an explanation. He knew that Allender had not communicated with her father, and this would be a real shock for Thomas. Brian met Thomas at the airport, and the old man kept looking around, clearly expecting to see his daughter. It broke Brian's heart to think that this good old gentleman would be disappointed. He invited Thomas to Cheddar's for lunch, and told him that Allender had left. What do you mean, gone? Asked Thomas. Where is she? And why didn't any of you bother to call me and tell me she wouldn't be here? To be honest, it's probably because we didn't want you to know, Brian said. It's a long story, so get ready. The long, painful story spilled out, and Thomas listened in shock as the sordid tale unfolded. There was silence when Brian finished. The tension eased with the arrival of the waiter, and Thomas ordered bourbon for both of them. I don't know about you, but I wouldn't mind having a drink, he said. They sipped their wine in silence for a while, and finally Thomas spoke. "Brian, I can't even express how disappointed I am in my daughter. I'm so sorry that I failed you both as a father. I can't imagine how you feel right now, and I will do everything in my power to help you. You must also understand that she is my daughter and I love her with all my heart, and I always will. I will express my disappointment to her the first time we meet. Then I will forgive her and still love her. My love for her does not depend on whether she is perfect or even good. I love her not because she makes me proud or because she is perfect. I love her because she is my daughter. I love her for who she is, not what she does." "I understand, sir," Brian said. "I didn't expect anything else." "So what are you going to do?" asked Thomas. "This situation is unbearable. This problem needs to be solved." "I was hoping you could tell me how to do this," Brian said. "Take me home and let me sleep," Thomas said. They ate dinner very gloomily in silence. They went to bed, and Thomas lay awake, thinking all night. He got up at 6 and prepared breakfast. When Brian got up at 7, everything was ready, and they talked over a cup of coffee. "As far as I understand," Thomas explained, "you have very few options. You don't know what Allender is thinking. You may think you don't know her at all. I believe that what happened is so out of character for her that she is broken inside because of it. 5 months have passed, and maybe she has found her way back. She hasn't told you this, but she may be waiting for something that none of us understands. I've decided that the only way back or forward for you two is a test. She will either pass the exam or fail. In any case, there will be a result. Do you think she's ready?" "I have no idea," Brian answered. "What kind of test?" "Let's see. I think I've thought about it," Thomas said. "From the way you described this Rains guy, I think he would jump at the opportunity to take a second shot at her. I think we should arrange this." "Jesus Christ, Thomas," Brian said. "Are you crazy? That's the last thing I want. You have no idea how many times I dreamed of killing that bastard. I don't want her near him." "Yes, I understand," said Thomas. "But the real problem is that you have no idea how she will react if she gets into trouble again. That's the crux of the problem. I think you should inform him through some third party that you have broken up. If he's as predatory as we think he is, he'll jump at the chance. If he doesn't react, it means we underestimated him. If he does, he'll be fair game. He will find Allender, and we will see how she reacts. If she closes it, we'll know it was a deviation. If she doesn't, we'll know she has some deeper character flaw, and you need to move on and leave her to me." Brian thought for a moment. "This is damn risky," he said. "What if he tracks her?" "Brian, I've hunted on 5 continents. You are very good yourself. We'll be watching her like hawks. I'll kill that bastard myself if he does any harm to her. You figure out how to get the message to him, and I'll plan the rest." 2 weeks later, Peter Thompson and Rains Parker were having dinner together at their base camp. "Tell Parker," Peter spoke. "Do you remember that cute couple that was here 6 months ago? Their names were Brian and Allender Celine. They both took the moose, and you were stuck with her for a while. She was very hot. Do you remember?" Parker looked at Peter but didn't say anything. "The boss said they broke up," Peter said. "This is a real shame. I thought they really loved each other. Do you know anything about this, Parker?" Rains blushed. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm not hinting at anything," said Peter. "I'm asking you directly. Do you have anything to do with their breakup? Can you confess like a man? I think your face says it all." "Talk to me like that again and I'll rip you in half," Rains growled. "Ha!" Peter laughed. "Just try to attack me and I will kill you like a dog. Having sex with a client. Did you get her drunk? She was cold and you offered to warm her up? Look at you, you damn sneak, right? She froze, and you took advantage of her. You son of a bitch." He pulled out a pistol. "No, sit back down. I'm leaving. I won't work with a dog like you. Thank God your daddy isn't around to see what a piece of crap he raised. I'll tell the boss what happened." He backed away from the camp, and Rains heard the patter of his horse coming down the path. He didn't care what Thompson thought. All his mind caught was that Brian and Allender had broken up. He still thought about her, every day. Her gorgeous face, the way those large breasts pressed against his chest, the look of ecstasy on her face, the sound of her voice and the impact of her personality. He had never wanted a woman more in his life. He dated hundreds of women during his football glory days, but none impressed him as much as Allender. He was going to find her and claim her as his own. Allender was working on her longbow. She made a layered bow using hickory backing and bois d'arc wood. It was a huge weapon, 79 inches long, and it weighed enormously. She practiced this art. She wanted it to be not only functional, but also beautiful. She was very proud of it. Someone knocked downstairs and she went to open it. It was one of her neighbors. Lars was a born boy. That was the only way to describe him. She felt he was a free spirit, something of a throwback to the hippies, and she liked him. What she didn't like was his persistent attempts to get her to go on a date with him. "Hello, Allender," he greeted. "I was wondering if you wanted to go get something to eat." "I'm busy, Lars. I'm working on the bow." "You need to eat. Why do you always tell me you're busy? When are you not busy?" "Listen, Lars," she said impatiently. "I like you, okay? You are a very handsome guy. You shouldn't have any problems getting dates. Why do you keep asking me? I'll always be busy. This has nothing to do with you. Have you seen me date men? You haven't seen this and won't see it. I won't go anywhere with you, and if you don't stop bothering me, we won't even stop being friends. Do you understand? Why don't you want to come with me?" He began to argue, but Allender heard her phone ringing upstairs. "I have to answer the phone." She closed the door in his face. Her phone went to voicemail when she found it. It was under the coat she had worn before, and she didn't recognize the number. Her blood froze when she heard Rain's voice. "Hello, Allender," she heard. "I know that I promised you never to remind me of me again. I heard that you and Brian are no longer together. I'm really sorry if this has anything to do with me. The point is, if you're not with Brian, I'd like to see you. I don't know where you are, but I have this number. Please call me. I need to see you." Allender dropped her phone. The memory of what they had done came flooding back. She remembered the excitement and painful pleasure. She also felt shame and guilt wash over her as if it all happened yesterday. Damn this man. She was trying to figure out her life, and now this. She wasn't going to answer his call. She came to terms with the weakness that had taken over her then and the way her body reacted to him. It was hard to accept, but she knew she had a deep character flaw that she needed to constantly be wary of. She didn't quite understand how she could have lost control of herself, but she knew how to prevent it from happening again. Now Rains was invading her life again, unwanted and hostile to everything she had ever hoped to have in her life. She returned to her bow. A million thoughts raced through her head as she ran through ideas. She had some plans. A good night's sleep would be a good start, and Allender went to bed in full accordance with her plan. The next morning she got up early, ate a hearty breakfast, and packed everything she was going to take with her into the car. While driving through Yakima, she traded her car for a four-wheel drive truck. The longbow was in a case along with arrows. It had a draw length of 30 inches, and the arrows were 2 inches longer. She was going to use 125 grit Woodman Whiteheads, and they came in a case too. She packed her things and headed southeast to Colorado. Brian and Thomas looked after her. They watched her for a whole week, not knowing whether Parker would call her or not. When they saw her start packing, their hearts sank. Brian watched her carefully through binoculars and saw the suitcase she had packed. There seemed to be a fishing rod there, but he couldn't figure out why she'd brought it with her. She and Thomas followed in a rented car and took turns sleeping and driving. Allender hurried as fast as she could, and when she finally stopped, they took turns sleeping in the car. She slept for 10 hours and went to McDonald's for breakfast. It became clear where she was going with this, and Brian wanted to leave. "She's coming to him, Thomas. I don't want to see this. I'm over it." "Stop being so small," Thomas told him. "Grow some balls, boy. I'll cripple this son of a bitch, and you help me." They were somewhat surprised when Allender turned off the highway and entered the forest. They watched as she hid her truck behind some bushes and pulled out something. She had a strange suitcase with her, and the two men quickly packed the camping supplies they had brought with them. Thomas packed his rifles and they headed into the forest, following Allender. She was heading back to the place where the nightmare began, and she was in a hurry. It took them 2 days to get there, and when they got there were no signs of life. Allender cautiously approached the camp and looked around. It had only recently been used, and she assumed that Peter and Rains had gone to investigate. She walked up the path she had used before and saw that the horses' tracks had turned. She moved with caution now, stopping to scan the area with her binoculars before continuing. She followed the horse's trail for 5 miles and smelled smoke. As she approached, she noticed him and cautiously moved forward. Brian and Thomas realized that she was tracking something and silently crept closer. They watched Allender take a bow from its case and draw it. She tipped 4 arrows and placed one on the string. "Crap," Brian whispered to Thomas. "She's going to shoot that son of a bitch." They saw Rains sitting with his back against a large pine tree, eating an apple. They crept closer when Allender was within range. She stayed in cover between herself and Rains until she had a chance to get a good shot. "Should we stop her?" Brian whispered. "Let him play," said Thomas. "This is her show. She must solve this problem." Allender stood up slowly. Rains heard a sound like a bird flying and felt a strong blow to his right shoulder. Excruciating pain shot through his body, and he realized that he was pinned to a pine tree by the longest arrow he had ever seen. He heard the sound again, and before he could react, he was hit in the other shoulder. His world went dark. Water splashed on his face, and he regained consciousness, spitting. He was in agony. When his eyes focused, he saw Allender pouring bottled water on his head. He hissed, and she knelt before him. "Hi, Rains," she said. "You shot at me." All he could squeeze out was a hoarse croak. "Yes," she smiled sadly. "Twice. I'm going to shoot you." "What the hell is wrong with you?" He wheezed. "Are you going to kill me?" "Yes, as promised." Her voice was level. "You ruined my life, Rains. You destroyed me. I helped you do it, but I'm better now. I realize that you won't let me move on. You will always be there, like a snake, crawling around my garden and stopping me from becoming who I once was again. For 6 hours, I was also a snake. Then I realized that I am not a snake. I'm taking my life back, Rains. You're losing yours." He looked into her eyes and saw his death. "Please," he managed. "I will never contact you again." "I never liked the word connection, used as a verb," said a male voice. "Another blow to you, Allender. It also seems to me that this promise has been made before. It was a fiction then, and I suspect, a fiction now." Allender rolled to the side, and when she got up, she was holding a very nasty-looking .40 caliber pistol in her hands. It was aimed at a man who approached her from behind. "Dad!" she exclaimed. "What are you doing? How did you find—" She rushed to him, hugged him, and sobbed in his coat. "I brought someone with me," he muttered. Allender raised her head and saw Brian appear from behind the rock. "Oh, God," she sobbed. She ran for what seemed like miles. She ran to her husband. All other thoughts disappeared. Brian was here. He walked up to her and hugged her, and she sobbed hysterically on his chest. "Are you going to shoot me?" he asked. She glanced at the gun pressed between them to his heart. She threw it away as Brian smiled sadly at her. "Hey, baby," he said. "You're in quite a difficult situation." "What were you going to do with him, Allender?" he asked, nodding towards the unconscious Parker. "I was going to shoot the arrow between these two, right in the center." "I can't let you do this," he told her. "What do we do?" she asked. "You two are going home," Thomas said. "I'll take out the trash. I'll arrive in a couple of weeks. Will you be there?" Allender looked at Brian hopefully. He nodded. "Come to Concanully," said Allender. "I think we need to take a break from everything for a while." Thomas nodded and watched as his daughter and son-in-law disappeared into the forest, hugging each other, the sound of their voices mingling and fading. He smiled. Everything should work. They walked about a mile when they heard 2 shots. They looked at each other. Brian raised an eyebrow and Allender sighed. They headed down the path. Subscribe to our channel so that your second chaff doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one. 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 Listening to the next one.